The Sword and the Cipher. Written by Riley O'Connor. Narrated by the author. Copyright 2024 by Windhauser Publishing. Prologue. The junior lieutenant had followed the Admiral back to the bridge of the Exemplar with some difficulty, despite the Admiral's small stature. She paused several paces up the final staircase when she no longer heard his labored pacing. Admiral Sorkatani turned to look at the lieutenant expectantly, the way a butcher might wait for a slab of meat to weigh up on a scale. The lieutenant was bent over, appearing to rest his legs, feet, lungs. No doubt by the time the Admiral enumerated his complete list of ailments, he would be ready to proceed. Admiral Sorkatani swept some imaginary dust off her sage-green uniform, admiring the pearl stripes of command while trying not to show the condemnation she felt. The lieutenant straightened then, pulling at his own rumpled uniform. "I apologize, Admiral," the lieutenant gulped. "My studies have kept me from my physical training routines lately." Admiral Sorkatani allowed her officers plenty of free time, but took care in knowing how they spent it. The lieutenant's excuse would be a reasonable one if he included time spent studying the bottom of an empty mug, but Sorkatani knew the mugs at the officers' lounge were not empty for long. "See to it that you focus on the fundamentals of your routine, rather than indulging in one particular area," Sorkatani lectured as patiently as she could. She put her well-polished boot on the next stair. "Then your priorities should fall into place." "Why do we need to go to the barracks anyway? We could have broadcast our communication or sent a courier and never had to leave the bridge," the lieutenant said, managing it all in one single ragged breath. "Knowing when to delegate is an important aspect of leadership. This was not one of those times. Our lance troopers have performed incredible exploits today, actions they may never be called on to do again. They deserve to be commended in person," Sorkatani explained. She resumed her quick pace up the stairs. The lieutenant swung himself up and followed. Though Admiral Sorkatani's first instinct was to kick the junior lieutenant a few rungs down the ladder of command, or indeed all the way to the floor, the council reminded her in her latest consultation that negative reinforcement could only go so far. Besides, the man had shown remarkable aptitude for both fleet tactics and diplomacy. He merely needed the proper motivation to get him back on track, or so the distributed artificial intelligence of the council had assured. Though the final decision was ultimately hers by way of command in the field, only a fool would repeatedly go against the guidance of the collective will of the innumerable neural networks of the Union Precept. There are many within the Union Precept that disagreed with our actions today. The events in the coming weeks will vindicate us, however. Sorkatani knew what was waiting for her on the bridge. Like her lieutenant, she dreaded the top of those stairs, albeit for vastly different reasons. She had detected the suppressed fear in her bridge crew's wavering voices when they had asked her back to the command platform as soon as possible. "We were right to do so," the lieutenant wheezed. "The Starkin were warned many times about the possession of the hostile weapons so close to our inner quickspace lanes. When we acted on the Council's foresight, we were avoiding the need for further bloodshed. If we can follow up on our victory and ensure the remaining—" "Yes, I am aware of the nuances of our own plan," Sorkatani snapped. She immediately regretted losing her patience, but it had been a long couple of days since she had last slept. She slowed her pace slightly and glanced back at the lieutenant. Bringing him along had been the Council's idea, after all. "If you could save every Union Precept citizen on one of our worlds, would you do it?" "Well, of course, but—" the lieutenant began, but quickly trailed off. "There is no right or wrong answer, Lieutenant. This is all off the record." "Ah, well then, I suppose it depends on what it would cost. We would need to know how many people live on the world, the disposition of forces in the area, supply chains. A logical progression and reasonable inquiry. Very commendable." "Could you narrow the parameters at all?" he asked. "Sometimes all we have is what little we are given, and the resolution to see it through," Admiral Sorkatani said, her gaze focused far beyond the walls of the bridge. The lieutenant opened his mouth to reply, but thought better of it. He grunted an affirmation and used the breath saved to propel him to the top of the stairs, just a few paces behind his superior. Admiral Sorkatani emerged onto the rear command platform overlooking the bridge, her boots tapping on the floor tiles currently projecting a pristine marble facade. The sprawling room reminded her of one of the old orchestra halls. The personnel modules for weapons, communications, and navigation systems were laid out beneath her in tiered rows, all facing the front of the Exemplar's bridge. All had their part to play in her symphony, which she conducted from above on her command platform. Her bridge crew paced among the consoles here, busily expanding and collapsing holographic displays, passing along new information, updating ship movements, all the while giving their admiral a healthy amount of space without appearing to do so. The wall projections gave Admiral Sorkatani an equally clear and terrible view of this system's shattered defenses. A massive railgun wandered into the magnified view of the bow cameras as an orbital platform drifted close by, just a few hundred miles in front of the Exemplar. The weapon maintained the elliptical path of its orbit, despite its bent and ruptured frame. The junior lieutenant approached the command platform railing and gripped it with white knuckles. It appears the remaining star scum are not all interested in peaceful resolution, as we would have hoped, he said. It is our duty to make them interested, and please refrain from using such vulgarities on my bridge. Starkin is acceptable if pressed, but Stavari is the preferred term. This clan in particular should be delineated as House Stravina to avoid indirect condemnation of the other houses. Sorkatani brought up logistics of the Ulustai system and began sorting through the damage. Some retaliation was to be expected. This was one of the larger world ships, and a fast blockade runner at that. Likely the ship that witnessed the destruction of their capital ship at Karnazad. It is a shame they bore witness to our attack and escaped, the lieutenant noted, at last able to breathe evenly. On the contrary, now they have evidence of the consequences that result when they willfully disobey our requests. Remember, this was no smuggling run or dodging of tariffs. Trovina possessed a deadly virus acquired through trade with the exiled colonies, Sorgatani explained. Or so the council claims. The lieutenant looked down at his boots. I understand, Admiral. All trade with the colonies is unauthorized. We could not allow such a weapon in anyone's hands, even our former allies. A sudden motion pulled Sorkatani's attention from the screen. The Admiral scanned the bridge and discovered a small rodent scurrying along the wall. Its gray fur was difficult to spot amongst the rows of equipment. Lieutenant, what is that vermin doing on my bridge? She asked sharply. What? Oh, I see, the lieutenant stammered. Nothing to worry about, Admiral. Rats do occasionally get on board during port stays. Most are relegated to the storage holds and exterminated, but some manage to sneak about. I am not interested in excuses, but results. Sorkatani turned to provide a suitable display of annoyance to her subordinate. I have already flagged it for removal by the sanitation drones. Sorkatani glanced back at the trespasser, but saw it had already vanished. She returned her attention to the forward display. Now, what were you saying? The Admiral drawled. Oh, sure, so one time I saw a rat that, no joke, was bigger than your... about the Stavari's trading habits. Oh, of course, the lieutenant stammered. We could not trust any such weapon in their hands. I believe you said former allies. Correct, Admiral. Our alliance with House Stravina is far from shattered, Admiral Sorkatani said. The targeted destruction of a world ship and its auxiliaries was necessary, given the risk involved to the unknown entity. The Stavari of House Stravina will all understand the actions we have taken soon enough. She turned her scrutiny to her forward screen and panned out until she could see a handful of the many hundreds of systems that made up the Union Precept. Its vastness was all the more impressive by its unity of purpose, expansion, advancement, and prosperity. It was a triumph of the human spirit and machine efficiency. I shudder to think how many systems the latent virus passed through before we tracked it down. That dagger poised at the very heart of civilization. Fortunately, it is out of the hands of the conniving Stavari. The lieutenant gazed out into the projection of Ulustai and its lone red star. Is it true that they reproduce through traditional means? Yes, exclusively, Sorkatani replied. Their women even carry their children to term within their own bodies. That's not even legal anywhere in the Union Precept, the lieutenant noted. Indeed, the process propagates nature's cruel chance of heredity onto a helpless individual and sets that burden on society, Sorkatani said. You know, many find my short stature odd for an admiral. Not at all, ma'am, the lieutenant replied, a little too quickly. Yes, well, it is no abnormality. My family had a generational contract with the Precept's navy. Our shorter height gives us a natural advantage as pilots, as well as overall improved metabolic efficiency and survival rates. Being the first in my family to achieve my current rank, I've since ended the contract. My progeny, if indeed I decide to create any, will be given the best hereditary suites available to forge their own path. I'm sure they'll decide to follow in your footsteps, the lieutenant said with a smile. Sorkatani ignored the sycophantic remark and tried to imagine what enhancements had led to her subordinate's current state. The Union precept covered the cost of basic genetic editing free of charge upon artificial inception, as an investment in an individual's health and future contributions to the Unity. But there would always be some who squandered or neglected their gifts. Well, that remains to be seen, the Admiral said with an air of indifference. The Stivari, on the other hand, preserve the human genome entirely unaltered, at least as much as they can, inherited as it is from our shared ancestors. The lieutenant turned away from the destruction on the screen to gaze in wonder at the Admiral. So, they would not switch off a single gene to save a man from blindness or mental disability? What about saving a woman from a terrible disease? He asked with a singularly fixed gaze. The Stivari augment the natural deficiencies with technology and corrective surgery when necessary, but your analysis is correct. The biology they are born with must remain untainted in their eyes, whereas heredity is simply another tool for us. They maintain ancient history as a biological imperative. The forward display zoomed out in response to a directed thought, and the mercurial network of quickspace passages that connected every system appeared. The lights undulated and swarmed, a can of worms the size of galaxies and probably larger. The only reason every planet was anything other than impossible to travel to, due to the restrictions imposed by the sheer scale of the universe, was due to these quickspace lanes. Somehow, humanity had long ago linked many of their solar systems through these passages, all tied together at a blue star of unknown origin and location. All that was known now was that they worked. The center of all these locations, the mystical object that made it all possible, was the blue star known as Alpha 1, the first and last place in any journey. A ship traveling through quickspace across Alpha 1 could make a journey of 1,000 years in mere days, assuming it was not lost to the depths of the star. Following the myriad paths of her fleets around the star-kin vessels, Sorkatani allowed herself a slight smile. Friendly ships were highlighted in a light blue, forward mobile fleets, reserve fleets, supply caravans, all locked together in dizzying harmony around the few red dots representing the ships of the star-kin. Their frigates and cruisers posed little threat to the Union precept now. Even the oversized, so-called world ships of the Starkin were no real danger when surrounded with sufficient firepower. The destruction wrought here at Ulistai would not need to be repeated, and soon Admiral Sorkatani would complete her task. The worlds that were her duty to protect would be safe from the virus, just as the Council had assured her, and her alone. Chapter 1. Safe upon the soil below, teeming masses live and die. Come with me, to thee I'll show our soaring cities in the sky. But if we tread not careful, and linger long around, those who far beneath us dwell will bring us to the ground. Stivari Children's Song. Thick flakes of ash drifted lazily through a haze of dust as Nason reached blindly for a handhold. Every piece of equipment on the ship had neglected his attempts to interact with them remotely, and this hatchway proved no exception. Granted, some functionality was bound to be lost when a ship is systematically boarded, disabled, and subsequently crashed into a planet's surface. At last, Nason grasped at a handle, which gave way after more than a modest supply of force. He gave a grunt, swung the great door open, and stepped into what could no longer in any honesty be called the Great Hall of the Asura. He could recall the illustrious chamber filled with no shortage of food, dance, and good cheer. Few of the carefully arranged pillars and tables remained intact, let alone in their proper place. Fissures rang along the walls, in a macabre renovation of the former decor's florid patterns and elegant filigree. Nason's cropped, auburn hair lay damp beneath the hood of a tightly bound crimson cloak. His Pan-Atmo mask echoed with the faint whisper of his muffled breathing, but more importantly filtered out any harmful particles in the air. Most of it was dust kicked up when the world ship crashed onto the planet known as Karnazad, but there was ash from organics like trees and other vegetation on board as well. Nason exhaled sharply through the mask. At least, he hoped it was only from the plant life. Though it now felt like an expedition that stretched over days, Nason had been methodically making his way through the ruins of the Asura for just over 4 hours. He and his crew had started at the stern, which, although it had been less damaged by the crash, as it was the last section to hit the ground, appeared to have been the first that the enemy had targeted. They proceeded slowly, not only to thoroughly search for survivors, but also to make sure they were not crushed by falling debris. It was to the bow that the ship's beacon lay transmitting its covert signal, or at least should be. Like everything else in the ship, it had remained eerily silent. The silencing of this signal, unique to the Stavari's own vessels, had been what drew Nason back to the home fleet station on Carnazad in the first place. When functioning properly, the beacon transmitted a clandestine signal even across quickspace. This allowed various far-flung Stavari to locate their house's world ships at any given time. This was critical for emergency meetings and, as Nason knew well, avoiding certain family reunions. The beacons were designed to mimic an aggregate of solar output, hydrogen spin flips, and radio wavelength background noises that occurred naturally in the universe. The beacon was a technological marvel, magic to most Stavari within the home fleet, and a sheer mystery to those without. The mask's dark lenses filtered out the harsh light now streaming through breaches in the ceiling, making the room resemble a charred painting. The captain's true Dravani, his personal bodyguards, crouched in the gloom no more than 30 paces away. Their own crimson robes were wrapped tightly around lightweight, serrated brown armor plating. As Nason approached, the closest rose to meet him. Something glittered in his right hand. "The room is clear, Nace." Camlo turned the object nervously in the nimble fingers of his artificial right hand. The limb was tongue steel, all the way to the shoulder. Nason saw the object was a fragment of something, glass maybe, or the remains of the clear panels that made up the shattered solar canopy above. Just like every other room we've been in, even the emergency bunkers. Nason squinted his eyes at the shadowed corners of the room, as if willing someone, anyone, to appear there and explain what had happened. Camlo made up half of his Dravani contingent. A barony or colonial governor could have up to 3 full squads in their garrison. As the captain to a small trade frigate, however, Nason considered himself lucky to have any of the elite bodyguards at all. His younger cousin, by a third his own age, Camlo's eagerness to learn seemed to be matched only by his penchant to forget. Beskin stood at attention, his rebreather concealing his hawkish features as he scanned the room. Light periodically glinted off his lenses, streaming in from one of the many gashes in the ceiling. The man had been Nason's first Dravani, and continued to serve not only as a bodyguard, but as a trusted advisor. "Relax, Beskin," Nason said. "I know it's unsettling, but we performed a thorough resonance scan from the Carmine Canatilla. If there was anyone still here, we would have found them. Let's proceed." "It's not the living I'm worried about, Captain. The unis took off in a hurry, but who's to say they didn't leave any parting gifts for us?" "We'll proceed carefully, then." Nason resumed his pace, no faster or slower than before. The twisted corridors and buckled frame of the great world ship Asura laid themselves out before his mind as though he were looking at an old picture recording. "Let's keep moving to the bridge, or what's left of it." Nason scanned his surroundings. Though completely still, anything could be hiding in the debris strewn all around him. With each hushed step, his eyes darted to another remote corner of the room as the trio made their way to the doors across the hall. "Not seeing any hidden explosives, Nace," Camlo chirped. "Of course, that would defeat the purpose of them being hidden," Nason replied. He knew what Camlo had meant, but someone had to start holding his cousin responsible for some of the things he said. Nason reached the door and beckoned Camlo forward. He hesitated. His face was a shade paler than normal, apparent even in the dim light of the hollow ship. "You're going to let Beskin's worrying get the better of you?" Nason forced himself to crack a smile. "I know you haven't been Dravani long, but I figured you had more sense." Thousands of Stavari lived on this capital ship. Our brothers, our sisters. How could they all have perished? Camlo let the shard of glass fall. It clattered on the tile but did not break. Nason didn't realize the Dravani had still been carrying it. Even if most died in the boarding action or the crash, a few must have survived. "I don't know, Cam. Maybe my father was able to evacuate those still aboard. Maybe a bold baron was able to make landfall and get them before the Unity dusted the planet, or they got taken prisoner." "I don't know," Nason said again, "but I intend to find out." The galley gardens were 2 floors below this one. There's nothing left but... Camlo turned away. Where do the old heroes of Dravina lay when their resting place has been taken away? Kaha, even this gathering hall could have inspired 1,000 poets for 1,000 years. Now look at it. I don't know, I'd be pretty inspired if I owned a repair dock, Beskin said glibly. We'd better keep moving. Camlo pivoted and set off down the corridor. Beskin followed, his head swiveling in shadows. After half a backward glance, Nason closed the gap. They continued in darkness for a long while. Nearing the next junction, Nason parted his lips to speak. Instead of speech, an aching creak of warping metal echoed through the corridor. The maddening groan was followed by a clatter and a metallic ringing. During the split second of clamor, Camlo and Beskin moved up to the T-junction and held the barrels of their plasma carbines down the right side of the corridor to the source of the offending noise. Nason opened the encrypted communication channel with a double click of his tongue. In an instant, he was connected to the pilot of the Carmine Canatilla. Lena, we need a targeted scan in the ship, he hissed. His heart pounded now, and the tension of not knowing what could be out there made the order seem blunt and fearful. He withdrew his sidearm, loaded it with a compact plasma core, and knelt beside a pile of rubble to cover the corridor. Sure thing, Captain, Lena snapped crisply back. By your tone, I'd say you were requesting an airstrike. No time for games, Lena. We need a resonance scan in Section 57. Tighten it down to 50 meters. Send the high-res readout to my pad if you can. Good, because we don't have any missiles. This is a shuttle, after all. Lena hummed to fill the intervening silence. Nason allowed himself to close his eyes. He felt the shoulders relax at her makeshift melody. He hadn't realized how heavy his eyelids felt before now. 50 meters. This was practically a hair's breadth for a quick-space trader like himself, but here in the ruins, it held his whole life, and possibly his. He considered how familiar Lena would be with the metric system, being a former citizen of the Union Precept. Though it was practically ancient, it was still generally used as the galactic standard in most places outside of the Union Precept. The UP, on the other hand, had its own relatively newer standards that made little sense outside of human anatomy and astrophysics. Nason snapped back to reality. Had something moved down the passage? He peered down the dark corridor, willing something to emerge into the pistol's sights. Okay, Captain. I'm reading nothing outside the massive battle damage to the hull and interior. I suspect you've seen plenty of that down there already. Jumping at ghosts? Some ruined parts of the ship must still be settling. Nason loosened his grip on the plasma pistol slightly. Most likely. This planet isn't exactly what you would call stable after the Unity's bombardment. Agreed. We're going to keep moving to the bridge to recover the beacon. Set the scans to automatically update every few seconds and extend the range to 75 meters. I think that's 24 parslats back in the Unity. Learning your old measurements was not the hardest part about flying for the Stavari, Nace. Maybe I'll even throw in the silly prefixes when it's convenient, Lena chided gently. What was the hardest part, then? Nason asked as he kept pace with his bodyguards. That would be learning the dulcinet, if you count how I played as learning anyway, the pilot noted. I still do not know why they require each new member to know a musical instrument. It's part of the well-rounded education and general enrichment that makes our way of life so enviable, Nason replied smoothly as he stepped over a fallen pillar. Right, Lena said with exaggerated dubiousness. Well, I will let you know if I detect anything. You let me know if you need a nice serenade. I hope your trip stays nice and boring. Thank you, Lena. Stay in touch. Nason set his pistol in its magnetic holster and withdrew his digital pad from its pouch on his thigh. He navigated to the stored scans of the ship with a few deft strokes. Lena was right. There was no activity outside their own, plus the 2 household troops covering the lower levels. He placed the pad back in its protective sheath at his hip. Camlo and Beskin lowered their carbines as Nason turned to face them. All right, let's move up on the bridge. We're getting close. He set off at a cautious pace straight down the junction. The Dravani alternated who entered each room first. Scan, breach, secure, and repeat. Camlo ducked into a dark room and brought his weapon about until giving it the all-clear. Beskin strode in, crouched low to the ground, scouring the darkness for potential threats. Nason followed them patiently, never questioning, simply leaving them to their methodical work. He kept his focus to the side passages and the corridors they left behind, always ready to hear back from Lena Set, in case she discovered something from her resonance scans as the Carmine Canatilas perched safely outside the ravaged hull of the world ship. Scan, breach, secure, and repeat. Minutes passed as the trio cleared every individual room, each one barren except for debris of the ship's destruction at the hands of the Union Precept Navy, and finally its last defeat by the invisible hand of gravity itself. The rooms felt alien to Nason, despite having walked them for much of his life. As they approached a wide, circular frame that once held a set of double doors, Nason felt his pulse quicken. His hands trembled, and he did not try to stop them. "It looks like the doors were blown open by an explosive," Camlo said from behind. "A plasma charge if the scorch marks are any indication." "Hard to tell," Beskin replied. "Could have even been a fractal discharge, considering the state of the bridge." His bodyguard's speculation barely registered in Nason's mind. He strode onto the bridge of the former capital ship. The grand chamber had been reduced to a collapsed ruin. The floor was fractured in 3 areas. The room now resembled a cavern of glittering tungsteel and smashed displays. Nason stepped cautiously over the floor, which lay at a 20-degree angle in relation to most of the walls. The floor was solid as he slowly eased his weight onto his front foot. He moved to the center with growing confidence, being careful not to trip over the unseen ledges of the former gantry. Nason gave a slight intake of breath. If he had been in command, perhaps this unmerciful disaster need not have happened at all. Silently, he cursed his father's whims to put him at the helm of his old, ungainly trade ship Lusterhawk, at its sister shuttle, the Carmine Canatila, rather than in command of a proper cruiser of the home fleet. "I'd always wanted command of this ship one day," Nason's voice thickened. Beskin advanced carefully behind him. "I won't fight you for it." "If I were here, maybe I could have helped swing the battle, or even avoided it." Nason clenched his fists as he felt a bubbling anger rise in him, one that he had suppressed out of necessity since arriving at Carnazad. His ire was not directed at the perpetrators of the destruction, but at the man who had set him to the side, where he could do nothing to avert this disaster. "No need to worry about it, Nace," Camlo said. "There's nothing we could have done." "Exactly!" Nason shouted and kicked a stone into an already cracked screen. "If I had a cruiser of my own, maybe we could have actually done something. Instead, I get stuck with this tiny, pitiful—" "I assume you're not talking about the Carmine Canatila, right?" Lena Set transmitted over the encrypted channel. "Lena, no, We're on the bridge. What's going on?" Nason asked. He had forgotten she would keep the channel open in order to report faster and to detect any disturbances in communications. "Resonance scans are picking up movement around the bottom of the ship. Are you guys okay?" "No contact with anything so far. More tremors?" "Seems likely. Still, keep an eye out. I'll be here ready to evacuate you in my tiny, pitiful, decrepit—" He winced. "Of course. Thank you, Lena." Nason beckoned with a gauntleted finger across the room. "Spread out. Look for any trace of the beacon." "If it's here, we'll find it, Nace," Camlo said, already shifting through a chunk of twisted metal and dead screens that was once a control panel. "Which is precisely why we won't find it," Beskin said. He kept at attention, always shifting his piercing gaze, as if daring something to come out of the shadows. "If we are not detecting it, then it was either taken by the Unity or destroyed by Yaska to prevent the former. Your father would never have given up the beacon, or his ship for that matter, while there was still breath in his body. Not while the Assyria was in his charge, not even while he flew the Lusterhawk. He was a man I was proud to follow." "Do you ever miss it? Being under his command, I mean?" Nason asked. Beskin gave a knowing smile. "I still am. Yaska's last order was to protect you, as I had him for all those years." Nason found himself smiling, despite himself. He turned and resumed his search of the bridge. They had to be thorough. Jeddah and Shukernak, the last of his skeleton crew of household troops, had investigated the bunkers. Perhaps the Trifalki had been fortunate enough to find something, or someone, useful. If not, Nason figured his next goal would be to regroup with any Stavari outside of Union Precept space, regroup and salvage what was left of House Dravina. He had to believe there were survivors out there, somewhere. He shook himself out of his reverie and clicked open a general communication link to the Trifalki. "Jeddah, how is the search coming?" "Not very successful. Nothing here but dust and memories," Jeddah said, a small sliver of hope in her voice. "But we still have a few living quarters to check before we rendezvous with you on the bridge." She means we haven't found anything, Shukranak interjected, and we're not gonna find anything in this blasted heap. I say we get out of here before the ceiling comes down and the people that we know are still alive. Better keep your chin up then. Perform your sweep of the living quarters, and then meet us on the bridge. I'll have Lena come get us in the Carmine Canatilla soon, and we'll be back on the frigate before you know it. Understood? Without wood, the fire dies, Jetta declared. Where the houses go, wealth shall rise, Nason said, returning the oath. He turned his focus back to the bridge. Kamla was shifting through another pile of debris as Beskin approached the gantry where Nason was surveying the area. Soft-wave gamma thinkers and low-frequency combs are all coming up zero, Beskin said in his cold, calculating way. Nason would have sworn his Dravani was rebuking him for wasting his time, were it not for Beskin's stoic demeanor. It looks like the Unis took the beacon, or destroyed it. Every trace of the Asira's network has been erased as well. Nason sighed. In any case, let's go ahead. From the deck came a deafening groan of metal and rumbling earth. Nason steadied himself in case a larger quake followed. It looks like the ship isn't as stable as we thought. Better get moving. More sounds of a dying ship? Kamlo asked, to no one in particular. Nason's mind conjured images of Union Precept commandos lying in ambush, pirates salvaging the wreck, and Deep Sun raiders scrounging for fuel and slaves. There were many scavengers that picked at the carrion of quick space. Your guess is as good as mine, Nason said. Maybe the ship is haunted, Kamlo said earnestly, his voice raising half an octave. Okay, maybe not quite as good as mine. Let's just keep moving. Beskin nodded in agreement. Kamlo glanced about, his stance still braced wide from the tremor. Good idea, Nace. Nason led the way out of the bridge with a brisk pace and clicked open his communication link with his ship. Lena, can we get a complete scan of the ground 3 kilometers in and around the Asira? It seems like the tremors on Carnazad are getting worse. Run me an updated analysis on the atmospheric content, too. My mask is reading a slight increase in sulfur and heavy metals. There was silence on the channel, and nothing more. Lena Set Dorada, this is your captain. Please confirm orders. Nason opened up his comlink to the Trafalki. He made 3 low taps of his tongue against the back of his teeth, wordlessly indicating that immediate, likewise response was requested. The silence of his comm channel was punctuated by another rumble that emanated from the decking beneath Nason's feet from far below. The high-pitched cry of a firearm echoed off a distant corridor. Sounded like a flux driver. One of ours? He was not sure whether he spoke to his Trevani, his silent crew, or to himself. He hoped the Trafalki were on their way to the bridge. Definitely gunshots. Solid projectile. Hard to gauge the distance from inside the ship, Beskin snapped. Another burst of flux fire echoed down the corridor. The walls all around shuddered with rapid, booming vibrations as though hundreds of people were pounding on them, desperate to escape. Nason broke into a sprint toward the source of the gunshots, with his Dravani following just behind, all weapons at the ready. Scavengers picking at the carrion of quick space, he thought again. They ran, the walls around them ringing like a gong. How did our sweeps not pick any of this up until they were right on top of us? Kamlo shouted back from the front of the trio. Whoever they are, they must have some serious stealth tech. Could they have hacked our comms? Nason made a quick glance to either end of the current junction before continuing. They could have been waiting here the whole time, Beskin countered. A loud hum preceded the next set of poundings. Okay, are we getting closer to them, or are they moving closer to us? Kamlo darted into the room and held his organic hand to his ear. I don't know, Cam. Just keep moving and check your corners. We need to get to our Trafalki and get off this ship. Sweep, breach, clear, and repeat. The Dravani advanced quicker than before, but not sacrificing their thoroughness for haste. They wound their way to the Trafalki's last known location in the sprawling living quarters. The humming fired up from behind this time, and Nason whirled around to face it. With a crash, the wall panel a dozen paces back clattered to the floor. It had crumpled as though it were paper. He did not stay to watch what, if anything, came out. Keep moving! Nason jerked forward to resume his run. We can't afford to stop or get bogged down. Whoever they are, they're coming in from all around us. Good. Now we can shoot the Chodras from every direction, Beskin called out. They rushed into the room where the Trafalki's last signal had been before their connection was lost. The large, oval room was large enough to fit dozens of Stavari comfortably, with places for their possessions and other amenities. On the floor of the quarters lay a pile of tiles surrounded by upturned earth. In the center was a hole, nearly Nason's own height across, that had been bored out through the ship from the ground below. He could not see far into the opening, but it must have been deep indeed. He thought he heard shuffling below. Maybe it was just falling rocks? He found himself questioning all of his senses. "Where'd Jetta and Nat go? They were just here," Camlo said, pacing across the room. Nason ignored Camlo and investigated the scene. Dents from flux rounds marked the surrounding floor and some of the walls around the room. The standard flux driver was essentially a portable railgun that a soldier could wield as easily as a conventional rifle. A magnetic field would be induced along a series of rails to hurl a metal projectile at fantastic speeds at the target, albeit much smaller and slower than a proper ship-mounted railgun. The weapon could be fired in nearly any conditions, even the vacuum of space, as long as the internal parts of the flux driver were intact. The floor tiles were crumpled, much like the wall panel had been. Though the thickness of the panels could not compare to the nanite-reinforced outer hull of the Asura, they should have held up better than the discarded tissue paper of bent plating that lay before him. Nason's mind raced to think of an explanation. "Camlo, cover the door on the opposite end. Beskin, watch the door nearest us and plot an escape route." They could leave and abandon their Trafalgar, but that would leave woefully few Stavari left in his crew. After this slaughter, the home fleet could ill afford such losses. Camlo lit up the hall outside the doorframe with plasma fire from his carbine. "Don't shoot to kill if you can help it, either of you." Granted, the interlopers' intentions were likely not good, but at least Nason had not been fired on yet. They had plenty of opportunities to engage, but they appeared to be encircling him. The fallen panel could easily have landed on Nason himself, or he simply could have been killed instantly by an explosive sent through the wall. Something was off about this attack. Nason considered the warped panel again. The panels must have been warped by some sort of portable compression technology, perhaps a mass condenser. The compression fields could be used for anything from exerting small forces at a distance to tunneling through solid rock and apparently reinforced steel. The attackers could be Armads, possibly survivors of the Unity's attack. There had to be some sort of guild presence on Carnassad, a mine, refinery, or manufacturing facility. "Kaha! Cease fire! They're not Unis!" Nason shouted over the disciplined bursts of plasma. Camlo lowered his carbine and looked at Nason with incredulity. "Well then, what do you expect us to use?" The Dravani was suddenly flung back by some invisible force. His limp form crashed onto an antique chest and slid across the floor in a heap. Beskin ran over and began laying down suppressive fire on the door that Camlo had most recently been watching. "Beskin, get out of here and back to the ship. I will try to deal with—" Before Nason realized what was happening, several huge figures stormed into the room from the far door. One crouched over Camlo, who was making a grab for his plasma carbine. The hulking figure slapped a black, ring-shaped object around his head, and the Trevani slumped to the floor. Nason tried to raise his hands in surrender. He knew these were not Union Precept troops, and therefore likely not his enemy. His armor grew tight around his arms and legs. His extremities became numb. Raising his hands was a supreme effort, but ever so slowly they crept toward the ceiling. He managed to release his pistol, which clattered to the floor. Nason barely got his hands waist high before his entire body was lifted off the floor. The rough leather soles of heavy boots around heavier feet echoed across the floor. A large form rose in his dimming vision. The man had the rough skin and ample frame of an Armad, men equally adapted to the vacuum of space as to the deep inner mantle of a terrestrial planet. He was massive, even compared to his fellow Armads. Like his companions, he wore gray plating festooned with yellow stripes and other shapes over his chest and extremities. These areas were presumably more vulnerable, though Nason wouldn't know it by looking at his stony skin. Nason now realized with mounting terror that he could not breathe. His vision narrowed to a tunnel. He could feel his heart thumping against his recast armor plating. Against projectile weapons, his armor would harden and sharpen itself against the point of impact to divert a shot. Against plasma weapons, it would change its surface properties to absorb high levels of heat. But against his heart, the recast armor held fast, unaware of how it constricted its wearer. An intense quiet washed over him. He noticed Beskin's plasma fire had ceased, and two bodies lay still on the floor that were not his own men. At last, the Armad spoke. His voice was a deep rumble. Yep, definitely one of these Starkin traitors. Soldiers by the looks of them. You lucked out, friend. My compatriot here wanted to blast a hole straight through you. It's not too late, Charles, a gritty voice behind him said. All we have to do is tell the boss that some conglomerate troopers ambushed us, and we just started shooting. Ambushed us in our own tunnels? Well, you're so dense the boss might actually believe it. The hulk of a man grunted and turned his slate face back to Nason. He grasped Nason's Pan-Atmo mask in his huge grip and tore it from his face with ease. This little vulture is more useful to us alive. Vulture? This was his ship. Well, in a way it was. The accusation was outrageous. Nason had shown them a modicum of restraint, and they treated him with disdain? He opened his mouth to chastise them, but his objections came out as nothing more than a gasp for air. All right, you've got a choice, Starscrap. I can tune down my condenser and we can have a nice, relaxing walk down to see the boss. Or you can take a knuckle-induced nap with your friend and hitch a ride on my shoulders. I only had one sleeper ring. Don't worry, I won't be bothered by the wait. Nason felt some of the pressure let off his spine and chest. He gasped for air, this time succeeding in sucking down some oxygen. A sensation of pins and needles filled his arms. He resisted the urge to call the big man a murderous brute, though it was by far the tamest of the outbursts that his shocked mind had conjured. I'll go quietly, Nason croaked. The Armad called Chels gave a sloppy half-grin. Well, look at that. He's smart for a Starkin, too. The Armad gave another signal, and Nason was free. The captain was not prepared to bear the weight of his own armor as he rose, his blood just now rushing back to his extremities. He fell forward and just barely caught himself on his palms. He gritted his teeth, and, as he shook with rage and exhaustion, all his cultivated diplomacy melted away. When people talk about somebody being dumb as a rock, Nason wheezed, you're the rock. What in quickspace are you doing mucking around in the ruins of an actual civilization? Even the tattered remains of our shattered halls are greater than you could conceive of in 100 lifetimes. You should have kept digging in the other direction until you hit the core so you could throw yourselves into it. The Armad shrugged his wide shoulders. I've made worse first impressions.